about 6 years ago, and we're happy to offer a webinar, which we started doing last year. We had an Electronic Records Day webinar, and we have one this year too. So we're happy that you joined us today in this new program. If you're just joining us, if you would type your name and institution into the chat box, we would appreciate it. Also, if you have any questions for our presenters that occur to you during the presentation, you can add those into the chat box or wait until the Q&A period to add them in. But we're happy to have you here with CoSA's Electronic Records Day webinar today. And I'm going to turn the microphone over to one of our presenters who's going to be your host, Kris Stenson from the Oregon State Archives. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Excellent. So yes, my name is Kris Stenson. I will be presenting this webinar here with Christian Skipper. We are going to be talking about information systems and smart decisions surrounding them relating to electronic records. So this is a new one for us as well. So hopefully you all find this valuable. So first of all, who's talking to you right now? Well, this is Kris Stenson. I am the administrator for the Oregon Records Management Solution here in the state of Oregon. This is a large statewide electronic records management project where we help facilitate records management sort of in a government cloud sort of environment for lots of different local and state entities here. Joining me is Christian Skipper. He is the appraisal and outreach archivist for the Maryland State Archives. And I've worked with him a lot in the past through CoSA and during the State Electronic Records Initiative project with CoSA. So he's got a great amount of expertise in digital records. As you can see here, I have a little tongue-in-cheek with our descriptions there. So I am a professional talker. That's pretty clear. I do a lot of this sort of stuff. Christian is the detail guy. So a lot of the information that is in here is out of his head. So hopefully you find this valuable. There will be a couple different sections. First, we are going to be talking about systems that you may be looking at purchasing or developing, and then later on we'll be talking about how to deal with information systems you may already have in place and how to deal with records relating to those. So sort of to frame the discussion, electronic records live in virtually every environment we can imagine within our offices. So think about the different places you might keep information. So you've got email systems and you have database systems, you have specific software programs maybe serving HR functions, finance functions, those sort of things. You might have large central repositories such as shared drives or other sort of network connections. You may utilize cloud storage. You may have offline media that you store information in. So we have records all over the place, and the problem is we still have to manage them effectively, and it's very difficult to do when they're all over the place like that. Many of these records live in information systems that were never designed or really intended for long-term record storage. And I'm not really defining the term long-term specifically here. It really depends. There's a lot of context necessary to determine what long-term really means. Generally speaking, we're talking about the concerns of records that might have to be kept for 10 years or 20 years or more. Again, depending on what kind of records, 10 years might not be that long. But certainly, we're not necessarily as concerned about records that, for example, may be only living for, say, 3 or 4 years. Those can pretty typically live out their whole lives within an active system without facing significant risks. However, there's definitely the risks multiply over time. And often what we find is that decisions about the software tools you're using, about the information systems you have, are driven by budgetary and business needs within an agency, which makes sense. Certainly that's what's driving it. We need something to help us do our work better, and we have to fit within a particular budget constraint. So that's what has driven purchasing or development of many of these systems. Unfortunately, records management has a tendency to get forgotten in that, and it's an issue that crops up after the fact in many cases. So this is what the purpose of this talk is going to be, is to sort of highlight those records management concerns and maybe give you some tools as to how to communicate with those folks within your entity that may be making these decisions or maybe become part of the decision-making process going forward. So with that, I'd like to hand this off to my colleague Christian Skipper, who will be talking about when you are looking at either buying or developing in-house an information system.
Hello, this is Christian. Can you hear me okay?
Gotcha.
All right, excellent. So what I'm going to be talking about today, as Kris noted, is kind of your best case scenario, which is to say building an electronic, building a system or buying a system that you have some control over from the ground up, rather than a circumstance where you kind of inherited a system from somebody else. So the first question that you'd want to be asking yourself from a records management context when looking to buy or build a system is what records are actually going to reside in the system. You can expand in the future, but you really want to have some idea up front whether this system is going to be strictly for your permanent records, whether this system is going to be for strictly non-permanent records, say email, correspondence, something very short-term, or what we see in a lot of cases, some combination of the two. Many agencies, be they local, state, federal, have need of a system that can maintain both their short and long-term records. So you do want to be considering up front the records management implications, as well as the state record laws and rules that may govern how you maintain this material. Some records, for example, have a kind of inherent value. They either by law or by what you know to be true about the records may be more valuable in their original paper format than any kind of digitized version. Additionally, you may have digital records that you could theoretically print out, but which the digital version bears some value above and beyond a type of printout. We found this to be the case, say, with email. You could print out email, and many people do, but oftentimes some of the more complex issues facing retrieval of email can only be adequately managed in an electronic system. So that's the kind of thing you want to be aware of up front when you're developing or buying a program. You're going to want to think about how long the records will be kept in that system. Most of the time, as far as I'm aware, certainly in the state of Maryland, records management is governed by the retention schedule process. There are retention schedules which are developed by agencies and submitted to the state archives for approval, and those outline specific series and types of records that the agency is creating. They also outline the length of time that those records are required to be maintained before being either destroyed for non-permanent records or transferred for permanent records. So you want to refer to your retention schedule when developing or buying one of these systems. If all you have on your retention schedule are documents to be maintained for, say, 3 or 4 years, you're not going to face some of the more sticky questions involved when you have to maintain records, say, for 50 years or even permanently. So be aware of that up front. How long you need to maintain your records will have an impact on which system you buy or develop. You'll also want to be aware of how records and metadata are exported from the system. I'll get into this a little bit more later on, but when we think of records management systems, sometimes we only think of them from the user perspective, and indeed in the short term. Can this system be used for me to explore what records I have and to access them from a workstation at my agency? In fact, those records live in highly complex digital environments, and the information surrounding them, as well as simple things like the imagery itself, can sometimes have a difficult time being exported from the system in the future. Again, this is less a concern for short-term records. For long-term records, though, you don't want to be facing a scenario where you lose access or control over that content. Finally, for this slide, you want to concern yourself with what the capacity is for storing content on this system. This is something that's often referred to as, say, scalability. A system that works for a small historical society in a local district might not scale well for, say, a state archives or a major metropolitan area's transit system. You want to ensure that when you're developing the system that it won't be crushed under the weight of digital content that you're creating. Always assume that you'll be dumping more content into the system than you initially expect. We are moving more and more into the digital realm, and I'd imagine that folks, say, 15 years ago would be shocked at the amount of terabytes of storage currently being used by repositories large and small. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, next we're going to look at how to access records in your system. You want to consider how you're actually going to make use of the records. One thing, going back to an earlier point, one thing that we tend to think of sometimes is that a system can simply be searched, like Google. You can just type in some sort of term and get results. But that is rarely the case in terms of these proprietary or custom-built systems. And indeed, often you don't actually want that to be the case. There is a curatorial element here where if you were to return all results in your system for vague search terms, it might actually become fairly unwieldy. So up front, you're going to want to figure out whether it would be more beneficial to be able to use, say, search fields, how extensive those search fields would be across content, across series, or only within one specifically delineated group of records. Or you may find it advantageous to be able to browse. Like I tend to think of something like a Windows Explorer, where you can navigate through clearly defined directories and subdirectories. Depending upon what level of finding aid or catalog you have for your own internal records management, that will have an impact on what kind of user interface is going to be developed. The user interface, of course, being what you actually see when you're using a program. One example I can think of with this is databases and Microsoft Access, where you may have a very complex database full of interlinked information. You might browse it simply using Microsoft Access, which provides a very simple user interface. So you want to be thinking about the front end and the back end when either talking to a contractor or buying a system from a vendor. You want to be sure that the system contains all the information that you need to find records later. Digitizing, this is something that we encounter quite a bit, and it's something that springs from a desire to do good without maybe all of the context necessary. Digitizing is not a solution to poor inventory control. Scanning your records and uploading them to some sort of server will not make those records more accessible than they are in a physical format. And similarly, printing out digital records is not going to make them more accessible to people in the future without applying some level of control to them. We like to use the phrase garbage in, garbage out. If you digitize a vast swath of content without organizing it or cataloging it in any way, it may well become inaccessible in the future. That's the kind of groundwork that's needed before moving your records into any records management system, be it a purchased or developed one. This ease of access is really going to be important for you complying with, say, Freedom of Information Act requests or whatever the similar law is in your state or territory. We've certainly found it beneficial to have strong inventory control simply so when we do get a request, we can comply with the time limits necessary. So on to monitoring your records. You don't just, say, dump a bunch of digital records into some server and let it be. You are going to need to apply some level of management to these over time while they exist in the system. Digital content, like paper content, can deteriorate without attention. Just think of, say, hard drives constantly reading and writing and reading and writing. And ones and zeros can disappear over time. And this is true of cloud storage as well. So you have to be aware of who is responsible for doing this type of maintenance. Is it going to be you, the, say, archivist, employee, Records manager, is it going to be your internal IT department, perhaps a state IT department, or maybe part of your contract with the vendor from which you purchase a management software is including that sort of outside help with the contract. That is something you want to have in writing and as part of the development or purchase of any system. You don't want to be, say, 3 years into a project and discover that you can't migrate your records. It is critical to be aware and have control over who can write, upload, and delete content. Oh, shucks. I'm sorry to say, this computer just locked up on me. While it's booting back up, let me continue from memory. Oh, I've got it here. Didn't touch the mouse in too long. So you have to be aware of who can write, upload, and delete content. I am happy to say this is something that my own institution does very well. Any record to be uploaded requires, any digital record to be uploaded requires a specific program to upload it. So there's a level of IT management over who can move information into the archival storage area. There is also an even stricter level of control over how content is deleted. The only users who can delete content are IT employees upon request from an archivist with justification for why records are being destroyed. And that only occurs in circumstances where, say, an erroneous duplicate was uploaded, that sort of thing. But I really think this works well as a model, a sort of, what would you call it, maybe a privilege-based model that different users of a computer system with access to the network have different privileges, reading, writing, and deleting content. That's really important for maintaining the authenticity of your records. You want to be able to say that these records were not modified over time. Or if they were modified over time, give an explanation of who modified them and why. That audit trail is going to be very important. We can move on to the next slide now. And this is a slick little graphic here. You want to be aware of how your records are being preserved over time. This is in keeping with the maintenance of your digital files. You'll encounter a term with some frequency known as fixity. That is putting measures into effect that maintain the integrity of the records, that all of the bits stay identical over time. And you do encounter a lot of trouble with data being modified, say, when it's transferred from an agency, an originating agency, to an archive, or maybe from one records management system to another. You want to be sure that those files stay identical because your records may well be needed in a court case, and you want to be sure that you can attest that those records have not been modified either maliciously or inadvertently. It's important to be aware of what metadata is being captured and how you ensure completeness. Metadata, of course, being the information about your records. Things as simple as dates modified, who the creator of the record was, all of that information. You can sort of go down the rabbit hole with this, geospatial coordinates, all that sort of thing. But you want to be sure that if you are, especially if that metadata is a key part of the record, I'm thinking particularly with something like geospatial coordinates, if that is not visible in the record itself, but is instead a piece of information that governs the record and is embedded within its digital file, you want to make sure that you're buying or developing a system that can make use of that information. You don't want it sitting away in cold storage space or inaccessible, anything like that. If it was created with the record, it probably has some value. And that value should be able to be carried forth in the current system and when exporting your records from that system. Automation is very helpful for identifying files that are at risk. If you look down there at the bottom at this, again, this cute graphic, about half of these are very secure files and half of them are not. You've got Adobe PDFs down there and JPEGs. These are generally not files that are at risk. They do bear the basic risks of bit rot and that sort of thing. but they don't bear some of the risks over here of Microsoft Word files and Excel documents that are tied to a particular software vendor. Even Adobe PDF files can be read by any number of open source programs. Your Microsoft Word and Excel files, on the other hand, you probably want to have an automated system in effect in whatever records management system you build or buy that identifies these, particularly at intervals over time, say maybe 3 years, 6 years, 10 years, because these are probably going to need to be modified over time. If they're permanent records, they really should be moved into a more secure file format. And if they're non-permanent records, you still want to ensure that you're able to access them for the duration of time that you're legally obligated to. So automating that is a nice way to take that out of faulty user control. Let's move on to the next slide. Exporting records is maybe the least thought about aspect of records management systems. Mostly because people working with records management systems outside of the archival world are most concerned with returning that information or accessing that information in the short term. 5 years, generally a records management system will persist for that amount of time. 50 years, very unlikely. Long-term records really need to have a plan in place before you buy or develop a system for you to either export them, update the system over time, or disassociate yourself from that sort of records ecosystem. One way to think about this that's very telling is how many of your record systems from 20 years ago are still being used. I can think of any number of agencies where they changed records management systems in the particularly the mid to late 2000s. There was a lot of turnover in these systems. Web 2.0 took off, and just our entire way of looking at records, digital records, changed. And those systems for 20 years ago really went into retirement and obsolescence. Now, some agencies are very good at migrating data out of old systems and into new systems, and that's really your ideal situation. But there are times when a records management system is developed with no capacity for exporting. Records maybe can be pulled out but lack their metadata, maybe the imagery is corrupted, or maybe whatever organizational structure they had is gone. And that really reduces coherence and accessibility to the records and could prove to be a pretty serious problem for an agency that doesn't take it into account. The idea of getting, say, a court order to produce a record that is in an obsolete system and that one no longer has access to, but one is obligated to provide since their retention schedule says that it should still be accessible, is an alarming one. So be aware of this going into the purchase or production of any records management system. Now, long-term records are going to need to be exported in the future, almost certainly. You want to be sure that their metadata can come with them. Again, going back to that earlier example of something like geospatial information, even digital photographs a lot of the time, in order to attest to their provenance and so forth, you really want that metadata to follow them into a system and then back out of a system when necessary. Many contracts limit who owns aspects of the imagery or metadata. This is a place where sometimes electronic records management system manufacturers and the needs of the records management community or agencies can be at odds because the company developing the tool may see it, not to be overly cynical, but may see it as more beneficial to lock you into their product. And generally the only way to avoid this is by introducing this as a conversation up front in the development or purchase of a product. In a less malicious scenario, the software developer might go out of business. What if your records were in some very bizarre proprietary database structure that nobody is employed to manage anymore because the company declared bankruptcy? You don't want your particularly public records or, heaven forbid, permanent records to depend on a company that may well go out of business. So ensure that there are measures in place that either when your contract ends, since licensing is sort of the way of the future with software developers, either when your contract ends or if the company goes out of business, that there's some level of migration capacity. As a general rule, 10 years is what you want to look at. Any records that need to be maintained for more than 10 years, you should assume that you will need to migrate them at least once. We can move on. And records disposition. Most of your records are going to be non-permanent. Well, that is true for any listeners who are at a non-archival repository. You know, I have sort of a skewed perspective since I work for state archives where most of the records that we have are other agencies' records which are permanent. So most agency records are non-permanent, and you want to be sure that your system allows destruction of specific records. I all too often encounter folks, well, I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus. Also often encounter circumstances where people believe that digital records can simply persist forever and should persist forever. And this is not the case. This absolutely should not be the case. It will be difficult to maintain these records over time, and you may well bear a legal responsibility if you do maintain them over time. So you want to ensure timely destruction of your digital records. Ideally, digital records can be destroyed in bulk based upon their retention period, but you may well find it safer to develop a system where somebody needs to authorize every records disposal. Be sure that your system can generate some kind of audit trail for records disposal. Again, speaking to my own state, we have a records disposal process where agencies are required to submit a disposal certificate indicating that records were destroyed and specifically which records were destroyed and under approval by what retention schedule. The easiest way to do this when large amounts of records are being destroyed in the digital space is to just have a system that automatically outputs information about records being destroyed, where you can generate an email or a PDF or something along those lines to demonstrate that records were destroyed in accordance with your laws. Let's move on. And that's it for me. We'll be handing this back over to the host, Kris Stenson, for information about dealing with existing information systems.
All right, thank you, Skip. Almost called you by your last name. Thank you, Christian. That was really good. Apologies for some of the wonky formatting there. We were trying to make everything fit at the last second, and it looked like I missed one, but that inevitably happens. What I'm going to talk about, so Christian was talking about what you would do when you are in initial discussions with a vendor or working with developers on implementing new information systems that might contain records. And for this next section, we're going to talk about what do you do, that's all well and good, but what do you do with the stuff you already have in place? Because all of us deal with a variety of legacy systems, some of which may have been running for quite some time, many of which were never really, we didn't have these conversations ahead of time, so we are retroactively trying to figure out what to do with the contents of these systems. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of these challenging issues, and I'm not going to say there's always a perfect solution, but there are some things which we may be able to do to help mitigate some of your risk involved with these old systems, as well as helping you more proactively manage the records they may contain. So you've got the system, and this is a generic term. I'm using the term system that could represent any number of applications utilized by a public entity. This could be, again, specific finance systems. This could be HR software. This could be something, a database is used to maintain information internally of all sorts. I think most of us have experience with at least one homegrown system that was designed 15 years ago, and then we lost the budget for developers. They left, and you try to talk to somebody about every time we do a patch, well, who knows how to operate that? Well, the last guy retired 5 years ago, and now we have to bodge it together, or maybe we have to hire him back on a contract so he can fix the thing that he built. This is not uncommon. So these present some pretty significant records management challenges. First of all, Christian talks about the importance of metadata. So that's the information surrounding your records that allows you to utilize them, that gives them meaning. Well, a lot of times these older systems don't do a very good job of maintaining that in a usable form, so we lack a lot of contextual metadata sometimes. There's data in there, but we aren't really sure what's what. We have a lot of intermingled record and non-record content. So the exact definition of what are public records in your state or your locality will probably vary slightly. But inevitably you will have some content that is considered sort of ephemeral, stuff that is short-term value, it is supplementary, or it is redundant. Maybe it's reference materials from another source, or maybe you're a duplicate copy holder, that sort of stuff. But it's often intermingled with records that are considered unique records of your entity and may need to be kept for quite some period of time. So it's hard to parse those out. Many of these old systems have poor or no export functionality whatsoever. So essentially your records that exist in there are held hostage, short of pretty significant efforts to extract them. You know, we see sort of rescue archaeology. You have to go in, get a programmer to hack an entrance into it basically and pull things out. There's often some pretty significant software layers between you and the records themselves. I've seen people work with systems that don't actually allow you to get to the files themselves, or they may in fact not exist as discrete files. So think about an access database, for example, where we might have, it's got a bunch of different columns of data elements that can be combined in different ways to form different records, if you will. So if you think about a driver's record or an employee record, traditionally those would have been sheets of paper in a pile that would have contained information that you would have used. Now all those little pieces of information are contained within this database, but they don't ever exist, they're not existing as a discrete object that could be, say, pulled out or moved or destroyed all at once, for example. So it's scattered, the information in these records is scattered all over the place, which makes it can be very challenging to then manage it. And then retention is almost never a consideration of these systems. There has been an ongoing challenge with a lot of systems being designed to just sort of hold things without any planning for actually purging things out. And as Christian mentioned, often you will exceed the capacity of the system to really do good work. So you've got too much stuff in there for it to really work efficiently anymore, but there's no convenient way to export or destroy content from it because it was never part of the plan. So first thing we do in any of these situations is conduct a little triage here. So we have antiquated system A here. We are in this situation, you know, it's an old text-based program you're dealing with that has information. So we start to ask some questions. How much life is realistically left in this system? You know, is this something that we're trying to sunset right now, or is this a software system that might have another 5 or 10 years to go? Because that's going to help determine some of the decisions you make about how you're going to deal with the content and potentially how much cost you're willing to pour into getting records out. The second question, of course, is identifying what records are stored in that system. So basically, there's two pieces of information you need to know. How long are we going to have this system, and how long are the records going to need to be stored? So we need to know what records are in there. Hopefully, even if they are intermingled, you should have a sense by comparing them to your schedule that what the retention would be of the data in that system. So again, then we compare it. Is the remaining life of the records, is that greater than the life of the system? And if so, especially if you're continuing to accumulate things, you can see that sort of benchmark keeps moving out. There is definitely something we have to consider then, how are we going to get the records out? So the next question, of course, is there an export functionality, and how complete is it? It may not be 100% complete, but does it meet your legal requirements? So it's important to consult with your authorities in your state for records management or your state archives to consult and say what information is required to be considered this record, for example. Because yes, while there may be lots of system metadata floating around it, not all of it may strictly be necessary. A lot of it's valuable, but it may not be absolutely crucial. And we're at the point here where we're making hard decisions. So at some point along here, you're going to have to probably choose what gets kept and what doesn't. How much cost are you willing to pour into something? And usually that comes down to what are our legal requirements? What is the minimum we can do in this case? And how can we get that out? So the question is, can we export, for example, in that access database, can we run reports that would generate a distinct record we could use, for example, either printed out as a print to PDF or printed out on paper? Generally, I advise against moving it to a paper. I don't like to see things moving from a digital to an analog world when we can avoid it. But there's usually, if there's some way you can pull stuff out, if not en masse, then at least discreetly. So that's a question we need to ask. So as I mentioned, a lot of this is hinging upon what your rules are in your state, and they do vary. I've worked in 2 different states now, and while there are a lot of similarities in terms of the basic rules governing management of electronic records, there are also some distinct differences. And certain states have more proactive rules regarding specifically electronic records and their maintenance than others. So you might find, depending on where you're at, you might have broader rules that just cover records in general. You may also have some very specific rules regarding electronic records and how you're allowed to maintain them, how you must keep them, file formats, and all those sort of things. So always check your state statutes that apply, rules, as well as your schedule to make sure that you have a clear understanding of what your requirements are, because then that's going to help drive the decision-making you have here. Are your records legally allowed to live in one of these systems long-term, for example? So, for example, here in Oregon, we have rules that dictate for records of 100-year or more retention, so essentially permanent or near-permanent records. If they're going to be kept digitally, they must be kept within an electronic records management system, which is a specific kind of software, and it must be compliant with a certain DoD standard, DoD 5015.2, which you don't have to memorize that, but basically it has to meet that benchmark. Otherwise, they are required to maintain those records in a physical format, whether that's microfilm or paper. That will not necessarily be the case in all of your states. You may have stricter or looser standards, but you need to check that to make sure, are you legally allowed to maintain the records? If you decided, hey, we're just going to leave them in this system for as long as they need to be there, double check that you're allowed to do that. Or is there a point in their life that you have to get them out somehow? Are the records kept in an acceptable format? So again, this is one to check those rules. Are there requirements regarding the type of file formats you're allowed to use? So this could drive decision-making about how long something can live in a system. Is there a benchmark where, well, we're allowed to keep it in whatever we're doing up to a certain point, and then we do have to convert it over to a longer-term format, a more stable format, as Christian mentioned. So that's something to look into. Are you legally required to destroy records at full retention? So this is a question that crops up depending on the state you're in. So in many states, retention schedules are a minimum retention period, but they are not a maximum. So theoretically, while it's bad practice, you are allowed to over-retain records if you have to. Certainly there are some extenuating circumstances that can dictate that sometimes, such as these sort of systems. However, in other states, such as here in Oregon, at least for state agencies here in Oregon, it is actually a minimum and a maximum. So efforts are needed to make sure that records are retained for their full retention and no longer than necessary beyond that. Obviously, there is a gray area of when can we realistically do this, and there's always a little bit of slight over-retention that can occur, but it's important to note that. So be aware, again, if you are going to be automatically out of compliance if you just decide to hang on to this. And you should also probably be aware of what your local penalties may be for noncompliance. Because again, what's the penalties for violation of whichever the public records law in your state is vary a lot. So you want to look into that. And realize also that mostly the penalties that arise from this are rarely from violating the Records Act. We at archives and records management institutions rarely have a squad of people going around arresting people for records violations. But what will very likely happen is that you might be faced with the burden of public records requests or FOIA requests, depending on where you're at, where you have to turn over records that really you shouldn't have anymore, or provide access to things that you really don't have a good mechanism to do so. So that's something to be aware of. Lawsuits are a much larger risk and much more common. So I'm going to pose a couple of scenarios here, talking about how we might approach one of these theoretical old system. Okay, theoretical old system that we'd really like to get things out of, but we may or may not be able to. So scenario number one, manage in place. So in this case, we're either looking at a system that manages short-term records, so may say less than 10 years in this example, or there may be significant barriers to exporting those records. So this is old, it's written in a software language that nobody around has expertise in anymore. The costs to get things out are simply prohibitive. We don't have the budget to do it. So we're going to be forced one way or the other to manage these records in place. Question we have to ask, are we able to purge? So if we can purge records, we really want to be exercising that ability and deleting things from the system as appropriate when they hit their retention period. This can be in certain systems that weren't designed for it a laborious process, because if it hasn't been proactively planned for, you may be doing a lot of manual mapping out of what's in there and manually going through and deleting. Perhaps you can get some scripts written that would allow you to do it, but that sort of thing, it can be a challenge. But you want to delete as much as you can when it's appropriate, so you are not retaining a bunch of junk over time. If your state is like Oregon, and I think most of them are, you might have a a requirement for retention, but and that comes out and says how long you have to keep something. But if you choose to have things longer, you may still have to turn them over in the event of a public records request. The fact that you had the right to get rid of those records does not mean that you can deny access to them later on if somebody asks for them and they theoretically could have been deleted already. So be aware of that. You really do want to try to, if you can, purge when it is appropriate. Now, in this situation, eventually this system, maybe it's got a few more years, maybe it doesn't, but when we hit the end of life for that system, we're going to be forced to keep it afloat in the background until all of the contents in it are at full retention, because again, we've decided we can't export from the system, and I have run across this scenario a number of times where people have a sunsetted system that only a handful of people have access to that just has to be kept afloat in the back room for a while, for maybe 10 years, which is, it's not cheap to do so. This is an inefficient thing. But we may have to, in some of these situations, to make sure we do not, because if we were to completely shut down this system and get rid of it, disassemble everything, destroy the contents, whatever, and it contained records that had not been exported and couldn't be, we're in major violation of public records law in most cases there. So we may just have to do this. This is just take our medicine because of decisions that were made 15 years ago, but that's just the reality of it. Now, scenario number 2 is the more appealing option if we can pull it off. So first of all, we would like to, in this scenario, we are going to export the records and we're going to retain them somewhere else. So we're going to say at a certain point, these things need to move out. So first of all, this is often in the scenario where either the records have a significant retention remaining on them, so this could be multi-decade sort of records, or they will outlive the system. So again, they might not be that long-term records, but the system's only got a year left of life. So we're going to have to get these records out of there. So the next step is to identify the logical export point. So obviously, an HR system or a finance system exists as its own software because it has a benefit. You're doing work in there. It has a financial or a business benefit to it. You're not going to want to be exporting records the second they're created because then you lose all of that business functionality there. So you're going to need to identify the logical export point. The idea is this is the point where the records often maybe they're semi-active, they're not requested much anymore, we're not actively accumulating information in them anymore, they're sort of in this long-term phase. Identify that point and then pull those records out and metadata that's appropriate. So again, you might choose which metadata is critical and which is not. Some system-generated technical metadata may or may not be critical, but the contextual information, things like notes surrounding things, free text fields you may have attached to them, search terms and other things like that, all are valuable and should be exported if possible. You must also then decide whether you're going to go ahead and duplicate the data for ready access or move entirely out of the system. So there's two options with this. Sometimes folks will say, well, we're going to move a copy of the records at a certain point and maintain that as sort of our preservation copy, but maintain the data in the active system so we can have it for ready reference. Or when we say, no, that's redundant, we need to clean this stuff out of the system, there's no point to that, are you going to move it entirely out and purge it from the system at the same time? So that's, again, a decision that you would want to make in this scenario. So other things you need to think about when you're thinking about these, when you're going through this process to help you make decisions is, can the system we're using currently meet the access needs we or our users might have? So, and this is my joke of searching and retrieval. So sorry, this is what happens when you look for visuals at 9 o'clock at night. So does the system you're working with accommodate ready search and retrieval? So there's obviously a wide swath of capabilities. Sometimes you may only have one entry point to the records. So in those scenarios, you might say, the system doesn't bring much to it. Maybe they'll be better somewhere else. However, there could be scenarios where your active system has a lot of great functionality for searching and retrieval, and so that would be another argument why you might want to maintain a copy locally, maintain a copy there, even if you do export a preservation one, to preserve that functionality. What's the active versus the inactive life of records? So active versus inactive is of course a gray area. If you're familiar with the idea of a record's life cycle or the record's continuum, depending on what you've looked at, the idea is that all records sort of have this natural tendency that they will be created, they will be heavily accessed for a certain period of time, they will then move on to sort of a semi-active phase when they may be used for reference occasionally but are no longer actively being contributed to, and then they often have this very long inactive life at the end of it where you have legal requirements to maintain them, but frankly they're not going to be looked at a whole lot, they don't need to be accessed frequently, and in those scenarios that can drive a decision where, you know, we don't need to worry about crazy levels of access because we look up these things once every 6 months and one person can do it easy enough. It's not that big a deal. Another question to ask, do you have an alternative search environment elsewhere? So if you are deciding to pull these records out of your active system, are you going to be putting them somewhere else in another piece of software or in another sort of database that's going to allow you to search well there? Or will it be better or worse than where they're at now? So these are sort of decisions you'll have to think about. And just remember, in all these situations, we're going to have to make some hard decisions. So more is not always more. You look about what you actually need and don't get bogged down in the perfect scenario because that tends to lead to nothing happening. So then, what do we do with the exported records? So we've gotten the records out of the system. What are we actually going to do with them? And there's a lot of variables here. Just because you remove them from this proprietary at-risk system doesn't mean they're safe now. Now you've got basically a bunch of free-range records floating around, and you have to do something with them. So first of all, know your state requirements. I mentioned earlier, you need to be aware whether or not you're required to maintain them physically in certain cases or whether you can have them electronically, what things might be attached to that if you are going electronic. So in our case, for example, needing to be maintained in that certain kind of system. Do you have a system of management in place? And this, again, I'm using system in a very generic term. I do not necessarily mean one piece of software. I mean a system of responsibilities, either automated through software or with people that play roles that will ensure that all those critical functions are preserved down the line. So making sure that the accessibility of the records is preserved, to make sure they are not altered, make sure they are, have some sort of security protocols attached to them, to make sure they are, kept for the right period of time and all that stuff. So one way or the other, you need to have some sort of system of management in place to make sure these can be maintained. And then what I would say is that more than a decade or so, if these things have more than a decade or so of retention, you really do need to consider a electronic records management system, or ERMS. This is a specific segment of software that plays a crucial role in proactive electronic records management, and it can be really invaluable when you're dealing with long-term records that need care and feeding, so to speak, to allow you to manage them at a large scale without driving all your staff crazy. So a brief moment to discuss that. An electronic records management system, and this is a very non-scientific definition, but it is a software system that allows for comprehensive management of records in all their aspects. So allows you to organize them, allows you to search and pull and access those records, and it can apply security, retention, and disposition rules to those records. The idea being that you map out what you need, you build them into the system, and then a lot of it gets automated behind the scenes. So we aren't reliant on employees, for example, making sure that they stay on top of the schedule and purging things manually, or applying the retention appropriately, or making sure security is applied by people. We want those things to be handled by a system. So this is where the electronic records management systems can really be a tremendous benefit. Certainly this is something that was not as prevalent in a lot of places a decade ago, but these days they've really become an essential tool. So again, if you've got records that you are going to be keeping electronically for more than a decade or so, it really does behoove you to look into your options for these sort of systems. Find out if there's people you can partner with in your state, or find out what the different options are in your area, because it does play a crucial role and helps protect your entity tremendously from risk involved with poor records management. So these sort of systems also ensure accountability in that they trace and track everything that occurs within a system. So there is always a clear audit trail, for example, of actions taken, which again preserves the authenticity of a record. So you dump a record in here, it applies an audit trail for every action taken on that record. So there's always you always know if this thing was modified and by whom, and all that sort of thing. Okay, last little summation slide, and then we'll get to some Q&A. Summarization? That's not a word. Summation. Here we go. So a lot of this is adapting to technologies as they come. So you might notice that I've given a lot of sort of generic advice here and not a lot of specifics. And we could go into specifics in one area, but it would take the entire hour by itself. So, and those of us that work with the Council of State Archivists, Those of us at your state archives, we are always thrilled to talk to state and local entities that have questions about this. I do encourage you to either reach out to your local folks or reach out to CoSA, and we can put you in touch with the appropriate people to help talk to you about how this might help you. A lot of this is, we don't know what we're going to be using in a decade. We can project, sort of, but we really don't know. I don't know, and I do this for a living. We always have to plan ahead without really knowing what's coming ahead. But if we always ask, whenever we're looking at software systems, what about the records? This will put us in better footing. We will plan, if a little bit of proactive work will help preserve this, so for example, the people that take over our jobs later won't be dealing with the same sort of junk we're potentially dealing with. Always think about the appropriate usage of new technologies. Just because you've got fancy new toys that allow you, for example, to communicate rapidly and everything else, or utilize information in new different ways, does not always mean that you should be utilizing all of those functions without first considering your requirements. Those of us in public service, which I believe is everybody on this webinar, understand that we sometimes have to hold ourselves back a little bit to make sure that we are thinking about the records in the first place and not just going whole hog. We can't go too crazy with new technologies if we haven't thought them through. Again, planning for the creation, capture, and retention of records before you're in the system is always going to be beneficial. So following that rubric that Christian laid out is going to be a lot better than having to play this triage game down the line. So I've got my little graphic here, so you can see sort of the progression of quote-unquote written formats. You know, it's a steady progression, but it's accelerating. So anybody, you know, stone tablets around for thousands of years, papyrus, we can still read 4,000-year-old papyrus. You know, paper documents, but then we get to Word documents, and you know, something that's 15 years old may or may not be accessible. So we're looking at an always accelerating time frame, and we really don't know what the next phase might be. So always be thinking about that. Okay, so questions. I think I saw a couple pop up, but I wasn't paying attention. So if you'd like to throw some in the chat box, we can address those. If we run out of time, we'll follow up with people after the fact. Let me just bring up the little chat box.
This is Barbara. There is one thing in the chat box that asks, are we going to send the slides out to the attendees? We actually will make the recording available on the CoSA website and CoSA's YouTube channel, and the slides will be accessible to you there.
Yeah. And
you had another question, any suggestions for an ERMS? So
right.
So I
so
don't know if you really want to get into that.
So I can, you know, and in fact, I will. We've got the participant list. We should have email addresses for everybody on here, correct?
Yes,
Barbara?
we do.
Yes. Okay.
Yes,
so
yes,
there is a list maintained by the federal government of electronic records management systems that meet that DoD requirement I mentioned. Now, and that's not the only standard out there, and it's not a hard requirement for non-federal entities, but it's the one we use as our benchmark. And it lists maybe a dozen different platforms from a handful of different companies that meet that standard, and that would be where I'd recommend starting. There's lots of other software that is ERMS-ish, but may or may not meet all those standards. So generally, my feeling is that why go halfway when you should go all the way? But some names you might hear, you might hear of things like Laserfiche or HPE Records Manager, although that's been bought by another company. It's now called Micro Focus Content Manager because companies change names all the time. There's software by OnBase and Alfresco. There's not an infinite number of these things, and so I'm not going to really recommend one in particular. But that list is a good place to start. And then if you'd like to talk to folks about the pros and cons of respective ones, reach out to CoSA, and we can have a conversation, just amongst colleagues about experiences people may have had.
If you have questions, be sure and type them in the chat box so we can share them with Kris and Christian. Okay, here's one. How would you respond to small agencies who claim to not have databases?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, whether or not databases or the contents thereof are considered records is something that differs state to state, and there's a lot of gray area. So
talk about a controversial topic.
Oh boy, yeah, that's something those of us in our profession haven't yet settled. So definitely, first of all, define what you're referring to in terms of that. You know, is there record content we're concerned about in this situation? Obviously, everybody has databases to some extent or another, but it's such a squishy definition. That's a tough one. I think I would refocus it into, okay, let's look at what your requirements are and where are these records. And you might find circling people around, you might find a situation where, well, I don't have any databases, but then you start to ask, well, do you create these things in paper anymore? What about this thing over here? And they may sort of sheepishly say, oh, that's in this software now. Well, there you go, that's in a database. So I'd probably try reframing that conversation.
Yeah, that has historically, and by historically I mean only really the last year or two that I've been encountering this, has kind of been the best way that we found to handle it as well. Particularly when, I mean, we handle it through the retention schedule process generally when an agency submits a schedule and says, we've got these records up until 2009 in paper, and then from then on they're electronic. And, you know, we get to asking, well, how are they arranged? Are they indexed somehow? If they're by, you know, say a number value, you know, this police department has case files 1, 2, 3, and 4. What's that managed by? And generally the best question to ask is, of the agency itself, how do you find it? Because that will tend to lead them to say, I put search terms into a, I mean, not using these words exactly, but I put search terms into an interface, something like that. And so that allows you to kind of broaden out the question to, well, where is that, what's that interface link up to? And more often than not, the answer is I'm not sure, but then you can bring in, you know, some sort of IT support on their end, because presumably there's somebody maintaining the system that holds their digital records.
I see the next question.
Is there a question?
Yeah, I see one here. Should public records be put into private hands, parentheses, the cloud? So, you know, it's funny. So the cloud, as people I think are hopefully aware at this point, just means it's storage somewhere else and you're accessing it remotely. That storage may be in one or more locations, and there's a lot of different flavors of the cloud, so to speak. Certainly, I think a few years ago, you would have seen a lot of folks in our profession sort of really shying away from that, but it's become sort of an inevitability. It's almost impossible to avoid in a modern business environment having at least some applications in a cloud environment. I think your local IT infrastructure is likely being cut in different ways, and you're sort of, many of them going to these sort of software as a service sort of things, you know, Office 365, good example of that sort of thing. There's nothing inherently wrong, in my opinion. Now, this is me representing my own opinion and also how we've done things here in Oregon. If you do your due diligence, make sure that whoever you're working with is reliable, has good vetting, and will follow the contract terms that you specify. There's nothing inherently wrong in utilizing the cloud, particularly as which they can throw resources at storage and preservation that most small entities can't. So in many cases, they may do a better job of this than your own hard-pressed department could do, no matter the intentions. However, you always need to be aware of, first of all, what your requirements are locally. Are you allowed to engage with a cloud vendor, for example, that's not in your own state? What about internationally? So you need to make sure that's part of the discussion. There are different levels of cloud vendor certification. I know the feds have one referred as FISMA and Federal Information. Christian, do you know that acronym? I forget the
Would you believe you saying it just now is the first time I've heard of it?
Well, there you go.
I have not encountered FISMA.
So there is, for example, I believe like Amazon Web Services, FISMA certification is something the federal government requires in some situations where it limits what the company can do in terms of where they can keep the data and the level of access there is. It's also worth looking into if there are partners within your state that might do it. To put in a small plug for the project I work with, so our Oregon Records Management Solution is in fact a public-private partnership. So we work with a consulting company that maintains a data center here in Oregon, but the data is in private hands, but they work exclusively with government. It's a private government cloud, so there's no public access to it. It's more secure than our own facilities are half the time. So we have great confidence in that. But a lot of it's doing your due diligence, making sure that ownership of data is always in the contract language, that you have control of that data, that you're guaranteed to get the information back, for example, you know, and those sort of things. Make sure you're very clear about what the company is or is not allowed to do, downtimes and all that sort of thing. it's a very big conversation that we're only scratching at here. But
so as a second
Kris
opinion
and
on
Christian?
yes.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well,
one more comment, then we're going to wrap up.
Yes, exactly. Very briefly, as somebody who has in the past been very very hesitant and cautious about the cloud as an overall concept for records management, I have to say that a fair amount of my caution is receding a bit the last year or so, for many of the reasons that Kris already outlined, particularly one of budget concerns, especially down on the local level. More power to you if you're able to have an IT department manage your storage. But if you don't, it can often actually be more reliable to have your records up in a cloud environment being managed by a company that has much deeper pockets. It's also worth noting that even when not using the cloud, there is a blending of the public and private sector with regard to digital record storage. I mean, even the fact that I'm sitting here looking at a Dell PC running a version of Windows that only has X number of licenses certainly gets at the idea that digital records require some level of collaboration between private and public entities. And as long as you do your due diligence up front with regard to setting the terms of those contracts, as Kris was noting, you have a similar amount of control, I would imagine, in a cloud environment as opposed to a local storage environment.
And this is Barbara from CoSA. I'm so sorry to have to wrap up this discussion because we have these great speakers who've given us so much information, and I know many of you have questions. If you go to the next slide, I'll tell you how you can get in touch with us if you have questions. CoSA has a website. We have a lot of information available there. We have information on a portal where we've gathered resources from all the state and territorial archives and some other instances to look at different electronic records or digital preservation issues. We have a lot of discussion on Twitter, particularly today since it's Electronic Records Day. But if you have a question for Kris or Christian and didn't get it to them today, just send it to Twitter and we'll send it along to them. And we also have a Facebook page which has a lot of the same information, just more verbiage. If you'll go on to the next slide, please. We have a
I didn't think it made it into the deck. Oops.
Okay. Somewhere we have a an evaluation form. Are we going to get to that, or is it not on the slide deck?
Oh, we had it. I think our scrambling beforehand, we lost it.
Oh,
okay.
No.
Well, we apologize for that. We actually, when we send you the suggested list of electronic records management systems, we'll also send you a link to the evaluation. So if you would fill that out for us, that would be very useful. We only do an electronic records webinar once a year. Maybe we need to do it more. Maybe you could tell us other topics you'd like to hear about. You give us some feedback about today, and we would appreciate it. So we will send that along to you along with the federal list of systems. And if there's anything else anyone else wants, just type it in the chat box in the next couple of minutes and let us know, and we'll email that as well. But please keep in touch with us. Look over what we've been doing on Twitter and Facebook today with Electronic Records Day, and we really appreciate you participating in CoSA's Electronic Records Day webinar. And we're so appreciative of our two speakers, Christian Skipper from the Maryland State Archives and Kris Stenson from the Oregon State Archives. So thanks, guys, for the great webinar, and thank all of you.